Today at the National Press Club, Age Discrimination Commissioner Robert Fitzgerald and World Health Organisation consultant Dr Marlene Krasovitsky. The pair will discuss the devastating impact and prevalence of ageism, the stereotyping, discrimination and mistreatment of people based solely on age.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, Canberra. My name's Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Australia is getting older. That's got all sorts of implications for our society and our economy. But is our view of age and ageing changing at the same pace and in the same way? Apparently not, with ageism still a factor that affects older people's lives in the workplace and in their life choices. To discuss how we can and should change that, we are today joined by two eminent speakers, Robert Fitzgerald, the Age Discrimination Commissioner, and Dr Marlene Krasovitsky, who is currently consulting to the World Health Organisation's global campaign to combat ageism. Please make them both welcome. And Dr Krasovitsky will speak to us first.
Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. May I also begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. May I also extend my respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with us today. I will focus my presentation today on answering the question, why does Australia need Ageism Awareness Day? Robert Fitzgerald will then expand on how we tackle ageism by strengthening our human rights, building inclusive workplaces and addressing elder abuse. So, why does Australia need Ageism Awareness Day? Let me answer that question with another question. How do you feel about getting older? That's the question that we put to thousands of Australians when we began Every Age Counts, Australia's national coalition and grassroots campaign to end ageism. What did we hear in response? Fear, dread, associations with decline, dependence, dementia. In short, getting older is seen as a negative time of life, certainly not one to look forward to. We deny getting old, being old, we hide it, we don't admit our age. And it's those negative views, assumptions and expectations that lie at the heart of ageism. Ageism is stereotyping, prejudice and discrimination towards others or oneself based on age. It's how we think, the stereotypes of older people as frail, forgetful, foolish. It's how we feel, our prejudices that old is bad, ugly, scary. And of course, how we act, discrimination, locking people out of work, excluding them from promotions because of assumptions that they're just on a path to retirement. Now, ageism can be experienced at any age, but ageism against older people comes from deeply negative feelings about what it means to be and to get older. Ageism is pervasive, it's acceptable, it's normalised, and it is underpinned by powerful stereotypes and unquestioned assumptions which lead to exclusion, marginalisation and inequity. And ageism is all around us in big structural ways like discrimination in the workplace or elder abuse, but also in everyday ways like making older people feel invisible, ignoring or deriding older people, and the way older people are stereotyped in media and advertising. So again, I ask, how do you feel about getting older? We've all internalised a bunch of really negative beliefs and fears about getting older. We don't question them, but they do have an impact on our decisions, our expectations, how we treat others, the language we use, and how we ourselves age. But if we can challenge those assumptions, bring them to light, then we can consciously and deliberately undo this limiting and devastating form of prejudice and discrimination. All of the megatrends and data tell us that generally we are living longer, healthier lives. But ageism is a barrier to ageing well. Now, much of the ageism that happens is not explicit. You don't formally restrict people over 55 years of age from applying for your job, you just don't consider hiring one. You don't ban older people from your shop, you just ignore them when they come in. And somehow it's still okay to tell ageist jokes, deem older people's views as irrelevant, treat older people as children and assume away their autonomy and decision-making capacity, and not take their health concerns seriously because, after all, it's just about getting older. To paraphrase Commissioner Briggs of the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety, it is ageism that enables us to accept poorer service provision because we undervalue the worth of older people. Now, ageism, like other forms of prejudice and discrimination, is based on othering. If they are not like you, well, then this opens up all sorts of different ways to think about them and treat them differently. But here's the thing. This is actually not about the other. This is about us. They are us. If not now, then soon. We are all ageing. And because none of us live our lives in one dimension, ageism intersects with other forms of discrimination like sexism and racism. An older woman's experience may be very different to an older man's or an older woman from a different cultural background. We are splendidly diverse. We are not one homogenous clump. So labelling, assuming, or treating us all the same is absurd. So back to our question. Why does Australia need Ageism Awareness Day? Let's look at some of the impacts of ageism. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 2 people globally hold ageist views, and 1 in 3 people across all age groups report experiencing ageism. And this includes being insulted, abused, excluded, or denied services because of their age. In Australia, research consistently tells us that people experience ageism, it has negative impacts, it locks people out of work, it marginalises people, makes older people feel invisible, it diminishes their value, their autonomy, their voice, and erodes their rights. It is often most keenly felt for the first time in the workplace, followed closely by in healthcare. With regard to workplaces, we know that nearly 1/3 of people over 50 experience age discrimination in the workplace. And while 2/3 of recruitment professionals say that they are experiencing recruitment difficulties, 1 in 6 of those professionals tell us that they actively exclude older workers from the recruitment process. This active exclusion is, of course, then reflected in the high numbers of people over 45 receiving unemployment payments, often for the long term. Once older workers lose their job, they're much more likely to end up being unemployed for the long term, running down savings, losing confidence, losing skills, becoming increasingly marginalised. And all of this in the context of historically high levels of job vacancies. We must acknowledge and address the hard barrier to the employment of older workers that is ageism. We also know that ageism has negative impacts on health and well-being. The WHO has found that if we experience ageism and we internalise all those negative beliefs, it will shave 7.5 years off our lives. Ageism leads to poorer health, social isolation, loneliness, and reduces quality of life as people become disrespected, devalued, and robbed of their humanity. And of course, ageism also affects how we feel about ourselves getting older. Many of us have internalised the rhetoric of older people as being a burden on society, rather than focusing on the many, many benefits and opportunities that flow from living and working longer. No one wants to be thought of as a burden. Framing older people in this way creates the conditions for the callousness, neglect and abuse that we have seen, for instance, in aged care. It feeds the depersonalising and diminishing of older people and their rights. The Elder Abuse Prevalence Study in 2021 empirically confirmed that the more ageist we are, the more likely we will condone elder abuse, and the more ageist we are, the less likely we are to recognise elder abuse. And so we have a problem, and it's ageism. And that's why Australia needs Ageism Awareness Day. And that's where Every Age Counts comes in. Every Age Counts is a national coalition of organisations, including community-based advocacy, research and service organisations and local councils, and many thousands of individuals who are working together to build an Australia without ageism. Now, these issues cross party lines, and Every Age Counts has received support from all sides of politics. These issues are above politics. These issues are about all of us. This is about enabling current and future generations to age well. And that's why Every Age Counts calls for a sustained national public awareness and education campaign on ageism and its impacts to challenge stereotypes, prejudices and discrimination in the workplace, in healthcare, in the community and so on. We've learned from the other great social movements that have changed the way we think and act, that change is possible. Think Me Too, gay marriage and so many other movements. And we agree with Minister Butler that age-based injustice is next. Australian politicians have united to make age discrimination illegal in every part of this country. But such discrimination remains rampant, as survey after survey shows. Laws alone are not enough. So it's time to shift ageist attitudes and change those negative, unjust norms and the policies and practices that flow from them. Ageism Awareness Day, initiated by Every Age Counts and now marked in many countries around the world, is on the 9th of October. This year we turn our sights to ageism in advertising. Why? Because advertising is a window into what society deems normal. The way people are shown or not shown in advertising has a powerful effect on how society sees them and behaves towards them, and it shapes our own expectations of growing older. If we see older people at all in advertising, we see tired, lazy stereotypes of forgetful, grumpy, frail older people holding up traffic, being baffled by technology, or as the butt of jokes. Ageism in advertising has got to go. We all have a role to play in this. Governments, communities, workplaces. And today I make an appeal to the journalists and to your profession. You don't need me to tell you that language matters. You are powerful when it comes to reinforcing or challenging deeply held norms, fueling tensions or building intergenerational solidarity. You are central as journalists to shifting the current negative narrative about older people and this stage of our life, in the language you use, the images you use, how you frame a story, and indeed the actual stories you report. And we stand ready to work with you. In closing, Every Age Counts aims to build an Australia without ageism, where we see positive policies, programs and narratives around age inclusivity, valued intergenerational links and the rights of older people and the intrinsic value of life at all ages. In short, an Australia that respects everyone and everyone's future self. Thank you. Robert Fitzgerald will now bring our attention to some of the steps we can all take towards achieving this in Australia. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marlene, and I must say it's a great joy to be here. I think this is my third appearance at the Press Club, but I'm now about 30 years older than the last time. So it's good to be back as an old person. Marlene has presented a wide scope in terms of understanding ageism in Australia, and I'll take a few issues in a narrow way. But firstly, I do want to acknowledge and share in her acknowledgement of country of our First Nations people, to acknowledge Kay Patterson, my predecessor, who sits there glaring at me to make sure I don't make a mistake, and of course the Honourable Robert Tickner, a great friend and also an extraordinary person, both as a minister and in his post-ministerial life. You know, ageism really does matter. And the best way that I can think about that is to look at what we do in relation to sexism and racism. Every single day, the Australian Human Rights Commission fights against sexism, fights against racism, and many other organisations and advocacy groups and governments do the same. If in 20 years' time we have to put that same energy into fighting against ageism, we will have failed. And frankly, failure is not on my agenda, and it's not on the agenda of Every Age Counts, because we can do something about it. As we see the figures emerge that within 20 years the aged population over 65 will be about 9 million, double that what it is today, and about 2 million will be over 85, we have a chance to plan. We have a chance to do things differently. We have a chance to shape Australia in a way that doesn't see ageism become the racism and sexism that is entrenched within the Australian population today. Surely we can agree that we all have rights to live, and as we age, those rights stay with us. Surely we can agree that we have a right for respect and dignity and security, no matter what our age is. Surely we can agree as a nation that older people should be valued for who they are, not simply for whom they have been in the past or what they might be into the future. Older people are valued because of who they are today, in this moment. And if we think about it in those terms, then ageism has no place at all. More Australians will certainly enter old age healthier, wealthier, and they will live longer. But there is a whole cohort within older people who are entering old age who are poorer, who are suffering enormous stress, financial and housing stress, will in fact experience increased frailty and dependency, and of course cognitive decline. So the narrative around older Australians is a difficult narrative, one of strength and one of weakness. The trouble here is that ageism is largely accepted in Australia. As the World Health Organization explains, ageism is highly prevalent. However, unlike other forms of discrimination, such as sexism and racism, it is socially accepted and usually unchallenged because of its largely implicit and subconscious nature. And that's an unusual thing when we come to abuse and areas of vulnerability for people. Ageism is sometimes unintentionally encouraged. And I've noticed that Marlene was talking about the target in relation to advertising. In a short time, next week, we'll be issuing a new report called Shaping Perspectives, which is an insider's look from the media. This is a report that talked to journalists, to those in the editorial rooms, to those in media companies, to talk about the way in which the media in Australia portrays and shapes perceptions in relation to older people. This insider's look at the media gives us a way forward by which the sectors, those involved in older persons advocacy, those involved in the services provision to older people, those involved in the financing of those services, and older people themselves can engage with the media, not simply through advertising, but in the broad aspect of journalism generally. And it's working together through those mediums that we create a better and different narrative. One of the other challenges for ageism is it takes place not only in a sense where we're ageing within an economy or a society, but for many they exist within dysfunctional systems and families. And ageism often begins as an underlying driver for many of those issues that beset older people, as we've talked about, not only frailty, but the risks that they pose in relation to elder abuse, which I'll talk about in a moment. My role is to give voice and presence to older people in Australia, just as Kay did, just as Susan Ryan did. It is to ensure that people do not become invisible and, worse still, voiceless within the Australian the Australian context, but also internationally. So the starting point for this is very clear. A rights-based approach is appropriate. If we do not have rights, it is simply a contest of ideologies, a contest of passions, a contest of views. Rights are something that centres public policy, and it centres us in the rights of the individual. It won't surprise you, therefore, that one of our highest agendas is to ask the Australian Government to finally agree and support wholeheartedly the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older People. It is well beyond time that Australia embrace the international rights for older people. Just as it is well beyond time that an Australian Human Rights Act and a complete codification of the current discrimination laws would benefit not only all Australians, but in particular older Australians. As Robert Tickner once said at a meeting that I had, he said, older people cannot be bystanders, cannot be onlookers in their own lives. Let's be clear. Older people in Australia cannot be onlookers in the decisions that affect them. They cannot be onlookers in the societies in which they live. And they can no longer be onlookers in the design and the implementation of the service systems that are meant to support them. They must be active participants in all of those aspects. Otherwise, ageism will in fact become the problem that we wish it not to be. Let me just take three areas. The first is in relation to mature aged and older workers and employment. This is an opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity. We now know absolutely three things. That older people in Australia want to work longer. We know that older people in Australia need to work longer. And we absolutely now know that the economy requires it. For the first time in my adult life, that coalescing of three things means that we need an active agenda to create workplaces, inclusive, multi-generational workplaces, in which all workers are valued, but there is a specific and a special valuing of the role of older workers in those places. In many workplaces, there are now so-called 5 generations, and there are tensions arising within those workplaces between the various age groups. Marlene's already indicated for older workers, just getting the job is in fact difficult. This is an area where we can and we must make great strides, and we look forward to working with those in private sector, the non-government sector, the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations and others in creating a robust strategy by which we have workplaces that are appropriate for people of all age and in particular for those who are older. And that's a great challenge because older workers do present in some ways different challenges, but so too do all ages within the workplace. The second area is enhancing the rights of older people to live free of abuse. I think no one in this room or in the audience could possibly disagree that older people in Australia should have the right to live free of abuse. Nothing could be more fundamental to the ability to age with dignity and respect and safety. And so the great challenge facing governments, the 9 governments of Australia, and all of us involved in this space is to in fact not allow elder abuse to continue to grow at the rate that it is likely to do so. 1 in 6 older people over the age of 65 already identify as having been abused in the previous year. 1 in 6. That's a huge number. And many of us also recognise that in that survey, that prevalence survey, it wasn't just that 1 in 6 recognised that they'd been abused, they regarded it as serious, significant. This is not being offended. This is not being talked to rudely. This is abuse. Physical, sexual, financial, neglect, all forms of abuse. So what have we got to do? The government's about to, I hope, present the national plan to respond to the abuse of older Australians. And when that is released, I hope that the 9 governments of Australia embrace with enthusiasm and commitment the key elements of that plan. It is a national strategy and it requires a national response. But it will only be delivered with the goodwill of all of us in the community, not just those that care about older people in the sectors we work, but everyone. We need to see the establishment of statutorily based adult safeguarding units right throughout Australia, like we have in New South Wales, South Australia and the ACT. The time has come for all governments to do what is right and proper in relation to the responding to an investigation of abuse. We need a fully engaged banking and financial services sector working together to better identify and respond to financial abuse. And let me say, this is one place in which the banking sector is really doing a very good job. job. It is really leading the charge in a way that I think is proposed well, that we can use the banking and financial sector in a way that really is an active participant in both the prevention and the responding to abuse. We certainly need an enhanced and well-resourced network of advocacy, legal and family mediation services throughout the nation and ongoing communication, because these are about reshaping the lives of people that have been abused. One of the things about elder abuse, which distinguishes it from family and domestic violence, is often the older person wants to stay connected with the very person that's abusing them, largely their son or daughter. They want to stay connected. But to achieve that, we have to change the family dynamics. That is about changing the care arrangement. It is about providing additional services. It is about trying to mediate problems. But most importantly, it's trying to create a safe environment as we go forward. And of course, the work that Kay started in relation to the harmonisation and registration of enduring powers of attorney is a critical element if we are to be able to run national campaigns about information and education, as well as improving the quality of those powers. And lastly, it's in relation to ageism in the social sectors, such as health and aged care. Let us not be foolish about what has happened since and during the pandemic. Both the aged care system and the healthcare systems across Australia diminished the rights of older people, and that continues today. Ageism is rampant in our healthcare system, and it is rampant in our aged care system. And it evidences itself fundamentally by the denial of the right of the older person to participate in the decisions that affect them. I am very pleased that the new Aged Care Act, in fact, addresses that to some extent. Nevertheless, just let me say this. We welcome the rights-based, person-focused approach to the new Aged Care Bill. But it is noteworthy that all of the rights that are articulated and the principles that are set forth are not enforceable in a court of law or by tribunal. They have to be, in fact, operationalised through the complaint handling processes, the settings of standards and so on. Why is Australia still doing this? Why do we not have the courage to give the rights to the people that should own them? Citizens, older people. It is great that so many jurisdictions around Australia are using rights-based frameworks for legislation, but it is a sign of weakness that we continue to have rights in legislation that is not enforceable. And surely we have got to a point where we can do better than that. In relation to aged care system, it is delightful to see and important that supported decision-making for older people is a part of the Aged Care Reform Act, or the Aged Care Act, and that is an essential part of giving longer life to the decision-making capacity of older people. We must pursue human rights as we age, including in the service systems that we have. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we go forward, there are things that we can do to reduce ageism in Australia. We can, in fact, a rights-based approach. We can, in fact, start to deal with elder abuse in a more effective way. We can start to create employment opportunities for older people within an inclusive, multi-generational purpose. We can, in fact, design and implement service systems with the input of older people. And most importantly, in a culturally diverse Australia, we need to have regard to First Nations and culturally diverse communities. We have to stop making public policy by white middle-aged men and women for white middle-aged men and women. I don't live in that world. If you're in Sydney, you don't live in that world. In Melbourne, you don't live in that world. In Canberra, maybe you do live in that world. But policymakers can't continue to design policies that meet my needs. They have to meet the needs of 40% of our community that come from culturally diverse communities. And that not only means that they have to be engaged in the policy making, but we have to be much more thoughtful about the way in which those policies actually are implemented in those communities. And gosh, didn't we learn a thing or two during the pandemic? Governments around Australia thought they knew and understood First Nations people. Even more, they thought and knew and understood culturally diverse communities. And they were wrong, and we were wrong. And ageism applies as much in those communities as it does in others. So today, ladies and gentlemen, I join with Every Age Counts in encouraging you and all of Australians to really embrace this agenda, trying to diminish ageism in Australia. And if we do so, we will in fact have a better society, not only for older people, but for all Australians. Ageing isn't the problem, but ageism is. Thank you, and may you age well.
Well, thank you both. Dame Edna Everidge once said that she was approaching 60 but from the wrong direction. I suppose one of the things that I wonder about everything you've said today is what is the definition of an older Australian now? I mean, people talk about over 55s and, you know, there are negative ads, but there are always those ads of people with perfect teeth and jumpers over their shoulders all having a great time at the aged care facility, which, you know, gives me a bit of a confused thing. But particularly in workplaces, a lot of legislation still does talk about people over 55 or not, but we are all getting older. I mean, who are older people, and what are the sorts of hard barriers they do face? At what age do we really start to see ageism kick in now?
Okay. It's a really interesting question, and we avoid pinning an older person to a particular age for a number of reasons. One is that our basic principle is that age doesn't define us, and by telling someone my age, it doesn't actually tell you too much about who I am, the sort of person I want, my preferences and so on. We ourselves have a very subjective lens in terms of our own ageing. Usually we don't see ourselves as old. Old is about 15 years ahead of wherever we are. So if I'm 30, it's probably around 45. If I'm 60, it's probably around 75. So there is a very subjective element to this as well. But it's true that in different data sets, we have age being defined differently. Sometimes it's 45, sometimes it's 55, sometimes it's 60, 65 and above. But one thing that all of those data sets seem to share is that they clump all of us over that particular age as being the same. So we don't see the nuanced differences between a 65-year-old and an 85-year-old. In the same way, we would never clump a 10-year-old and a 30-year-old together, would we? So there is that subjective element, and I guess one of the things that we would want to see more of is age disaggregated data so that we can appreciate the different impacts of being certain ages, whether it's in terms of workplace attachment or recruitment and retention and so on, whether it's in terms of health, even in terms of clinical trials. Often it's 60 and above, and we don't know whether those trials have an impact on people who are 85, or we extrapolate the results of those clinical trials to older people, but it's from a younger cohort. So that's a long-winded answer to.
There's a couple of just policy issues I think we have to deal with at the moment. Mature age workers are defined at 45 years of age, which seems unreasonably low. In terms of elder abuse, it's generally 65, but for Indigenous people, First Nations people, it's 50. That figure alone should tell us something about the well-being of older Indigenous people. So I do think that I agree with Marlene. We don't need to have strict ages in most things. But when we come to statutory schemes and so on, there is a discussion to be had about what that actually means. But it is different for First Nations people.
I suppose, but I think you said, Robert, that you know, it's not just about what the laws say; it's about our attitudes. And I suppose what I'm curious about is, do we know much about whether the perception of age, as you say, is changing, so that the sorts of discrimination people are suffering, say, in the workplace, is actually affecting older people than it once would have, say, 10 years ago?
In relation to age discrimination, there are actually very few age discrimination complaints relative to the size of the problem. It's right throughout Australia, including the Australian Human Rights Commission. One of the least identified areas where people coming forward is in fact in age discrimination. I think that's got a lot to do with older people themselves. They almost self-select out. They say there's no point in complaining. We know that in relation to employment, what's happening in Australia at the moment is older people aren't even going for the jobs, not because they want them, but they believe that they won't get them. So working with the department and other players, we've got to do something about changing the attitudes of older people, whatever that actually means, as well as, say, for example, the employers. So I think there is a shift and change in the way in which we see older age, what it means, and what it allows you to do. And of course we've got the very real area that the pension age has gone to 67, may well go higher. So just in terms of government policies, that's redefining what they see as old age. And I suspect that trend will continue.
And just being a question hog for a moment, I suppose one of the things that really strikes me when you talk about service deliveries and things, and this, I've got my dear old mum very much in mind here, but her complete rage and frustration about the fact that technology is not age friendly, that she hated being told go and look on the website, that basically technology is changing the lives of all of us, but maybe it's one thing where, particularly if people do become isolated, they can't keep up. Is this a particular issue that we have to deal with as a society?
I think we have to pay really close and informed attention to ways in which we can narrow the digital divide. More of us are needing to do our everyday transactions, business interactions, communications in forms that we are still learning about. And I think as older people age, that there will be more expectation that the technologies that they're being expected to use and the platforms they're expected to be going to will be designed with their needs in mind, not the needs of their children and grandchildren. So I think and hope we will see a demand from consumers to shift that along, because there are real barriers for many, many people, some of whom are quite au fait with technology, many of whom are not. But yes, we do need to design those systems in ways that meet their needs, not the needs of their grandchildren.
And so one of the challenges in this space is that digital exclusion is now a hot topic for governments, the private sector, the community. But the mistake we're making is believing that because people enter older age with much enhanced digital capacity, then that's the answer. By the time you get to 75, a good percentage of us are starting to that journey of cognitive decline. Some of us won't, but many of us will. By the age of 85, that percentage has increased dramatically. And so public policy has to, in fact, move with the lived experience of older people as they age. And so the danger at the moment is there is a view by the tech sector that, if you get to 65, you'll be much more computer literate. But even if you're computer literate today, if you are going to be in that circumstance, it's going to change. So this requires policy and service provision to be really very dynamic in a sense. It's the same, we've been working with the banks and financial institutions. I've met with 20 banks so far. It's about how they not only deal with the 65-year-old who knows how to use technology, but what's going to happen when that 65 becomes 75 or 85. And so this is a complex environment. But the good thing is there's a lot of people out there in the field, and it's a great place for government to be able to bring that together in a coherent sort of narrative, I think, and also some really good and exciting, innovative products that are out there.
Simon Gross has a question.
Simon Groves from Canberra IQ. Firstly, one of my cute lines about getting old is it's better than the alternative.
That's true.
And I don't know why you're bothering with one of these flaky days. It's World Pharmacist Day today. The only people who care are the pharmacists. But my question is about that there's a fairly cool aspect of age discrimination going on at the moment, emerging, and that's intergenerational envy and rivalry, and it's perpetrated by politicians down, people who should try to be pulling the society together, and it's often linked to housing affordability, climate, environment.
Indeed.
Can I get your reflections on that as an aspect of ageism?
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, as to the day, Ageism Awareness Day, you're right, there are lots of days around the world that we mark. We are particularly keen to support the idea of Ageism Awareness Day because ageism is still so invisible, because awareness matters, and this is an opportunity to build awareness. Nothing changes without starting with building awareness. So if we're not aware of the issue, as we sometimes aren't in relation to ageism, advocacy stalls, voices are silenced, nothing changes. So at this stage, it's very important, we think, to raising awareness around ageism. The other thing about these days is, like Pharmacist Day, that's a particular cohort that might be interested in Pharmacist Day. But this is actually about all of us. We're all ageing. This is not about a particular interest group or a particular product or service or particular anything. This is about all of us. So there is great potential to bring people around something like Ageism Awareness Day. So that's why we believe that it is important to raise awareness. Now, in terms of intergenerational tensions and conflicts, our position is that we cannot continue to define each other by age and then pit ourselves against each other. Yes, you're right, we're not looking at this through rose-coloured glasses. The inequities are real. Whether it's in climate change, resource allocation, economic security, you name it, we'll find it. But the answer to addressing those inequities and addressing those pressing issues is not to pit generation against generation. Today's younger people are tomorrow's older people, and we have a shared interest. Our futures are intertwined. We're not about cementing the privileges of older people at the expense of younger people. We're aware of the tensions. And the reality is that intergenerational solidarity, or building that solidarity, brings great benefits. We know this from the World Health Organization report. It reduces ageist attitudes. It also builds cohesion. It builds shared responsibility. It builds mutual understanding. So using the lens of building intergenerational solidarity to address some of those inequities is really, really critical. All people of all ages care about those inequities, and so we need all hearts and minds at addressing those inequities.
Can I just make two observations which are very practical? One of the biggest problems at the moment is a societal shift in the late transfer of wealth from my generation to my children. One thing we know about adult children in Australia is they are impatient. And as a consequence of that, we will see a very significant increase in financial abuse. And nothing you and I can do about that, because that's what will occur. There is no doubt we are going to see...
That will just occur.
Yep, and it is occurring. The second issue I just want to make a point about it is this. This generation, my generation, rightfully gets blamed for a great deal of issues. Some of them right, some of them are not. You've already identified this increase in sort of tension, and it does evidence itself around housing affordability and other things. But I want to make one point, and that is we are responsible for one thing. This is a generation who has singularly failed to fix the tax system over 30 years. And the consequence of that is that we are a low-taxing, high-spending nation. And it now impacts. It impacts on young people in terms of housing affordability, education costs, and it's impacting on older people with the new government's, quite right, increased co-contributions by older people, and they'll increase over time. So the consequential failure of our generation to deal with one of the most significant economic problems, and it continues, actually impacts both on young people and ourselves as older people. Having said that, I agree with Marlene absolutely. The danger Australia faces is if this narrative of division grows based on age, and we have to collectively work against that, the media and ourselves.
Kat Wong.
Thank you for your address today. So older people are treated pretty differently between diverse and non-diverse communities, and speaking from my own experience, you know, many people in the East Asian diaspora, they live in multi-generational households. So I wanted to ask, what are some differences in the ways that ageism manifests between non-white and white communities?
Thank you for that question. The simple answer is we don't know enough. That's the kernel of that answer. We all age in a cultural context. The context within which we age really will have a major impact on how we age and how we are seen, how we are able to participate, and so on. We make lots of assumptions, and we think we know about how this community and about how that community thinks about getting older and their older people. The reality is we don't know. We continue to make lots of assumptions though. And as long as we make those assumptions, we fail to do the hard work of asking the questions and finding out. So we might think that, yes, in our cultural context, ageing is feared, denied, to be avoided, but over there, everyone's happy, everyone gets it, everybody is much more integrated and so on and connected. We don't know that to be the case. Now, Every Age Counts has been very fortunate to be supported by the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils of Australia and Aboriginal Community Services, and they've been steadfast supporters since day one. Some years ago, we did some work with the Federation of Ethnic Communities Councils. It was a small scoping study to look at how ageism is experienced in Arabic, Vietnamese-speaking, Mandarin-speaking and Greek communities. And it's a very preliminary study, but some of the highlights were that ageism does seem to be moderated in communities where there are strong family connections and community networks. The circumstances under which people came to Australia and when they migrated or when they came as refugees has an impact, and language matters. So if you are unable to communicate with those around you, it will certainly exacerbate feelings of isolation and loneliness and marginalisation. But as I say, these are very early days. We should know more. I should be able to answer your question with more evidence. But the heart of it is we don't know. But we continue to make assumptions.
And if I could just bring back a really practical example again in relation to elder abuse. One of the great challenges is elder abuse, that elder abuse occurs in all cultural communities. But the way in which you enter that particular discussion, particularly if you're trying to intervene and respond to abuse, is exceptionally tricky and different. Many of the communities that we're dealing with do not have a word for abuse, and the notion that elders are abused is an anathema to their cultural context, but it happens. And the greatest challenge we face is how to work with communities where shame is at the centre of their responses. When I was on the Child Abuse Royal Commission, one of the things we saw in ethnic communities was that the children would present to the parents and indicate that there was abuse. And the immediate response of the family was that you'll bring shame on the family, you'll bring shame on the community, you'll bring shame on the church, and by the way, he wouldn't have done it anyway. The same thing's now occurring in elder abuse. And the one point that we've made is that we have to work with communities, not to say you shouldn't feel shame, I can't do that, but to work around that so that we can respond in an effective way. Because the one thing that cannot happen is that the older person who's being abused is the only person that has to bear the impact of the shame. Children did, and older people mustn't. So it is a really practical and very good question. But learning how to do it is exactly the same, Marlene, is something we do with those communities throughout Australia.
And just how much data do we actually have, not just on this, but it sounds like from a lot of the conversation so far that we just don't actually have all that much data on the experience of ageism. And where is the best place for that to be collected? Is it in the Human Rights Commission, or is there another body that can do it?
Well, the World Health Organization has done the first ever global report on ageism, which looks at prevalence across the globe and impacts across the globe. So that's a really, really good place to start. But you're right, Laura, in terms of impacts, we tend to have good data in the Australian Human Rights Commission in terms of workplace discrimination and prevalence of elder abuse through the Australian Institute of Family Studies. But yes, we perhaps need something a little more coherent and comprehensive.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a question about the aged care reforms as well. So like the Commissioner noted, there are no criminal penalties for things like serious harm and neglect. What would having enforceable rights do to change the way that we treat older people?
So there are different issues. I don't want to comment about the criminal penalties. Others in the room are experts in that. Just let me be very simple. Rights are given to you as an individual, and they travel with you through all of our systems. In the Aged Care Reform Acts, it is very good that it is a rights-based framework. The rights are well articulated, and again, I don't want to comment on the individual rights, and so too are the principles. Except the only way they become rights for you is through a whole process, the incorporation into standards, the way in which complaints are dealt with by the new Complaint Commissioner, the way in which the whole system is activated. And if it fails to operationalise the rights, then the rights aren't there. And this is a problem we've got in Australia, is we're doing more and more in the human services around rights, health, aged care, disability. That is good. But at the end of the day, it is a very difficult and circuitous route to ensure that right, whereas the other way is to say, you as an older person has this right that is enforceable at law. So I don't want to be critical of the new Act in the sense that I think it's a huge advancement and I hope it works. But I do make the point that I think it would have been better, stronger, if in fact those rights had become enforceable. But I acknowledge the political reality and I acknowledge that Australia is not yet at a place where it feels comfortable in doing so. But at some stage we must get there.
Thanks. Melissa Code.
Hello, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. Thank you for your talk. When I listen to you both speak, reading between the lines, hear you both articulate an invitation for all of us to care more about everybody. And through that message, I also sort of hear failures in power sharing, the way institutions and systems have been incapable of adequately capturing rights-based approaches for the best outcome. And I'd like to ask if some of the problems we're wrestling with here in considering the ageism problem or ageism challenge is bigger than just how systems and institutions respond to these problems. It's bigger than just attitudes about how I might perceive an older person. It's got to do with things like wanting people to live for as long as possible, maybe, or another possible alternative might be obsession with me and my interests and my welfare and my wealth, because, you know, if I'm a close study of history, my outcomes will greatly improve if I'm rich, not so much if I am a human rights advocate who reforms and changes the system. So what other cultural, social, community things do we need to change to improve both the system and individual approaches to ageism?
Do you want to start off?
So, look, in general terms, there's a couple of things that are happening. The first is that we all have different views about how we wish to age and what we will be like in 10 or 15 years' time. Just do that exercise for a moment. What do you think you'll look like by the time you get to 75 or 80? And you have a different view about that. The second thing is there is in Australia a very diverse view about the role of government, the role of supports and services, who should pay for various things. So we are a very mixed, an economy and a mixed society in the way in which we think about our collective responsibility. We have no difficulties as a community to say we should care for children, and we regulate that in all sorts of strange and weird ways. None of that is true with the older people. We don't have it. Now, I'm not immediately coming to the conclusion that we want to say, oh, we should treat older people in the way we do with child protection. That would be shocking, because being older people have a right to their own voice. That is, you know, what we call will and preference. In the jurisdiction that I was in New South Wales, and I headed the Age and Disability Commission for the last 5 years, it's a will and preference jurisdiction, whereas child protection is best interest, other people making that determination. So here we want to value the voice of older people. But there isn't a common way by which Australia actually sees ageing and how we want older people. The other problem is just practical, if I can. Like superannuation. Superannuation was always established so that it would help fund your old age. Now most people think it's there for their children's inheritance. Now, where do we go wrong on that? You know, whatever your view about mandatory superannuation, one of the good things was it was meant to, in fact, defray your costs in old age. Now people complain endlessly if there's the slightest change, which actually makes that happen. So, again, just in a practical sense, Australia is not at war with itself, but not at one with itself as to how we see what ageing should look like. And I'll give you just one last example, this notion about ageing in place. Everyone says ageing in place. I headed the inquiry into the care of older Australians with the Productivity Commission in 2010. That mantra came through. But if you genuinely believe in ageing in place, then you've got to have three things. You've got to have the right to accessible and affordable housing, because if there isn't, there's no place to age. You've got to have the right to affordable and accessible health care and aged care that can actually be serviced in the home. And the third thing is you've got to have the right to be connected to your local community, because it is that element that actually goes to the heart of our well-being. So you can say, oh, we all want to age at home, but for governments that actually has real obligations and, in my language, real rights.
So if I can just add to what Robert said and pick up your point about superannuation was actually designed to reflect continuous working man's life, and we certainly see the gendered impacts on superannuation that doesn't take into account women's working lives. But back to your question, I think the answer is all of the above, all of those things. One of the analytical frameworks that I always have in my head is borrowed from the World Health Organization, where it talks about 3 types of ageism: institutional, interpersonal, and self-directed, which I've called today internalised. And that helps me look at a sector and an arena, a policy arena, to see what can I see in terms of how ageism is manifest. So if for instance, we've both talked about healthcare as being somewhere where ageism is rife. So if I think about the institutional context, for instance, I'll see discussions about aged care health rationing on the basis of chronological age. I'll see a lack of education and information in university curricula for health professionals. I'll see lack of access to preventive screening, for instance, cutting out at a particular age, whether it's cervical cancer, bowel cancer, mammograms, heart risk disease, and so on. If I then jump down to interpersonal ageism in the healthcare system, I will see older people's symptoms being dismissed due to their age, just as a natural part of the decay of getting older. I'll see older people stereotyped as bed blockers, a waste of resources, they're going to die anyway, and so on. And all of that will result in different treatment options being put forward, delayed diagnosis, and sometimes those impacts will be deadly, devastating and deadly. And then if I look at the self-directed or internalised way in which ageism might operate here, it will be, at its worst, my belief as an older person that I am a burden on the system and I do not have a right to equal access to healthcare. So that, for me, is a useful framework within which to analyse the impacts and therefore to develop the strategies.
The question I had was about more older people staying in the workforce or re-entering the workforce and the ageism they may encounter in navigating that process. A lot of what you spoke about today was, you know, the perils of putting profit before people. It concerns me that we sort of look at what productive use we can get out of old people and squeeze the juice out of them before they keel over. So I'd like you to comment on that. But then also from the lens of the public service is talking a lot about stewardship and thinking about being good ancestors and building a better future for future generations. Do you think in the conversation about ageism and combating ageism, we need to actually talk about elderhood and being good elders, whatever age we are?
I might do the first part of your question. It's quite right to expect productivity returns from older workers. And in fact, we should celebrate that. I mean, one of the dangers we do is that we ourselves say, in a sense, well, older people aren't as productive, but in fact they are in many environments. Yes, there are some circumstances and alteration adjustments, but I think we have an expectation that workers should be productive at whatever age. If they cease to be productive, I don't think they should be in the workforce, because that would diminish the very value of that person in that workspace. It would turn it into an activity centre. So we're not about that. We're about meaningfully engaged, productive workers in meaningfully engaged, productive work. So I think that's really important. And I think older people are up to that. The second thing, however, just in relation to that, there are adjustments that have to be made, particularly when you're starting to look at the leaving the workplace and then ultimately the workforce, and they're two entirely different matters. So, for example, in the public service does not have an issue about employing older workers. About a third of the workforce is over the age of 50, I think. Their problem is cultural. There are growing divisions between the cultures in their workplaces, and department heads, including Catherine's here, would know that. The second thing is, how do you actually plan that exiting in a respectful and meaningful way? That's a big one. For others, it's actually about the recruitment stage. It's about devaluing. And the most extraordinary thing that's happening now with AI is the AI technology that vets all of your CVs has an inbuilt bias against older people because it's preconditioned on the decisions you've formerly made, which is around younger workers. That bias has to be removed. Otherwise, you can try all the cultural pieces you like, but they won't get through the door. But just my point is, I think older and mature age workers are productive, should be productive, and I think, but they are valued for more than just that.
I would add to that, as you raised, Robert, there's a burgeoning literature around how to harness the benefits of a multi-generational workforce. And this literature doesn't deny that there are differences that all ages bring, but actually it provides evidence that there is more in common. We have more in common than our differences. There may be differences in communication preferences of people of different ages, but in fact, we all want to be valued, we all want to contribute, we all want to learn new skills, we all want to see a pathway. And so this multi-generational workforce literature kind of boils down to 3 key strategies. One is ditch the old stereotypes, they don't work, they get in your way. Secondly, it's about abilities, and it's about contribution, it's not about age. And the third thing is it says, have a plan. Address this in a deliberate way. And what we've both encountered is that diversity, equity and inclusion plans will always include a whole range of grounds of diversity. Very few, if any, will include age as a ground of diversity. And so if age is not a part of your plan, it's invisible. It's hard to have a conversation. It's hard to do the cultural piece. It's hard to know where the pain points are in your organisation, whether it's at recruitment or exit and so on. So get the data and have a plan.
Nick Stewart.
Thank you, Robert. It sounded very much in your speech, for follow-up Kat's question, as if you're wanting legislation to actually enforce this. Is that the case? And the more broader question, I suppose, is more generally, isn't there a concern that as we all become tribes with flags, that we end up becoming exactly the sort of people that politicians can set against one another, the old people against the young people, the people with houses against the people who don't have houses, etc.?
Well, a couple of things. If I can just take your last point, just bear in mind in the electoral roll for Australia, the proportion of electors over the age of 65 is already over a quarter. Even though the population is only 17%, the electorate roll, by the time we get to 20 years out, with the figures we've talked about, that group will be in the high 30% of the electoral roll. So just bear that in mind, and politicians will bear that in mind. The challenge for that is that at the moment they're in demographically diverse groups. You can actually see where they are, but that will change. The second thing is, legislation is not my starting point at all. I'm very pleased we have the Anti-Discrimination Act, which was started 20 years ago, and that needs to be improved. It's a good piece of legislation. But the thing I think we've been talking about is largely cultural. Now, if there are impediments that can only be removed by legislation, sure. But my starting point in just about all the conversations that I've had so far is not about a legislative framework. It's not about more regulation. In fact, I think Australia is in deep peril if it continues to legislate and regulate everything that moves. I think it's the wrong course. And I'm a person that believes the government is important. So no, my point is a cultural shift. But if there are barriers that contribute to or prevent what Marlene's been saying, then yes, but that's not the starting point.
And the only other point that I would make in terms of the pitting one group against the other and all of us waving our flags, in terms of the fueling the intergenerational tensions and divide, I often ask myself, whose interest does it serve to fuel these tensions? And I consider this is exactly how prejudice and discrimination works. It's all about, as you say, setting up the other and then pitting us in conflict with each other. And what we're asking for today is to get beyond that. This is about all of us.
Patricia Sparrow has a question.
Patricia Sparrow, Chief Executive of Council on the Ageing Australia. Thank you for your presentation today, and agree 100% about the new Aged Care Act being a big step forward, but the rights needing to be enforceable. But my question is more about, we've talked about today about awareness, which is really important. CODA's dedicated to getting people to be aware. How do we turn awareness into practical action? And what are the things that you think you can most do in employment and in other areas to actually get recruiters to consider to employ someone over a certain age? Over 45 is where it starts, and get employers to recruit people and work with people in their workplaces. What are the key things that you can do to turn awareness into action?
So just, well, let me take a public policy approach. What we've been doing in my role in the last 5 months, and I'm sure Kay is been talking to employer groups. So I've spoken to most of them. I've met with the Secretary of the ACTU. We've met with private consultants that are engaged in this space, and we're working with the department. We believe we have a role to bring that together. So there's lots of good stuff happening, but it isn't coming together. And right at the moment, as we speak, there is no coherent strategy. So that's the one thing we can do. In terms of the practical applications, there are guides, even on the department's website, our website, about how you have age-friendly, as it used to be called, or age-inclusive workplaces. The critical issue is that the employing bodies actually value the employment of older people. Do they seriously want to employ older people? Now, for some, they've got no option. In the home human service areas, we have a chronic labour shortage. It is chronic, and it's going to be chronic for a very long time. There, you have no choice but to work around how do we have older workers. In others at the moment, it's probably a good idea. Well, maybe we should do it because of diversity. That will change. So I think the fact that it's now becoming necessity will be the driver of invention. But the first point I go back to is, does the employer genuinely want to employ older workers? And is this a place an older person would want to work? If you answer those two questions positively, you'll start.
And the only other thing I'd add to that, Pat, is that what we're seeing is maybe not so much a commitment to older workers, but a recognition of multi-generational workforces, and that in order to harness the best out of everybody, there needs to be a deliberate strategy. So whilst I said that we don't tend to see age as a ground of diversity in diversity, equity and inclusion plans, what we are seeing more of is a commitment to developing multi-generational workforces and working within their workforces to develop whatever strategies are appropriate, whether that be at recruitment or mentoring or cross-functional teams, that kind of thing. So the solutions will depend on where the pain points are, and the pain points will be identified through data, but people aren't collecting that data at the moment. So that would be all I would add.
Just two quick points. The first is older workers are also a problem for younger workers. If you survey younger workers, they talk about older workers' attitudes, and there's truth in that. So this is going to be not just about how do we treat older workers, but how do older workers actually treat the rest of the workforce, because we're not all easy to work with and for. So that's the first thing, which is really very important to understand. So this is not, oh, the older people are wonderful and we should respect them, but everyone else can go to hell. That's not what we're talking about. And that's not going to happen. Just the second thing is, it does require a coordinated strategy. And there's another reason for that is, one of the problems that I mentioned before is that older people self-exclude.
Yes.
So when you say to them, oh, you know, how are you working? They say, oh, no, I can't get a job. And you actually ask them, have they tried? And the answer is no. And that self-exclusion, which I did refer to in this speech, is important. This is where the government is really important. The government's had multiplicity of job networks and markets and everything else, and it's changing again. But the one thing government is responsible for is empowering individuals that can access the workplace. I think many of the other organisations that I've referred to are much better about embracing working with the employers to try to work them. So there's two things that have got to happen, and I think there are different roles for different government, private sector, unions in that space.
Well, just finally, you mentioned the WHO work. Which country in the world, does it tell us, does this well, and why?
It doesn't. Is the short answer. There is no one country, one place that seems to be immune to some of these issues and these challenges. Certainly in higher income countries, there are more strategies, there is more awareness, there is more campaigning, there are more protections than in low-income countries. But there are issues across the board, and of course not strategies that will work in one cultural context will not work in another. And I'm just thinking about the workforce here. I was at a session recently and I was talking about reverse mentoring older people mentoring younger people mentoring older people. And in that context, there was no way a younger person mentoring an older person was going to be acceptable. So there are those cultural differences. Sadly, we can't wave the flag and say X is the way to go. The responses to these issues, these issues are pervasive. The responses to these issues are more localised. There is more investment in high-income countries to recognise and address these issues than in low-income countries.
Please thank our speakers for a very interesting conversation.